Hello, Shalom Aleichem. Welcome back to another installment in this series, one verse a week. This week's Parsha is Parshat Balak. That can be found in your Bibles from Numbers chapter 22, verse 2 through 25, verse 9. This series is being produced for the reading cycle for the Jewish year 5779. If you have found this series or any of my other projects to be a benefit to you, I wish you would consider becoming a patron over on Patreon, or potentially making a small donation via PayPal. You can find that information in the details below. Okay, let us begin. Parshat Balak. Okay, this week's Parsha is actually, this week's verse is actually quite a difficult verse. And the reason I chose it was for those of you that have been following along, a handful of you, for all these weeks, I wanted to show you an example of how the pronoun game in Hebrew can really become quite difficult for the translator. Okay, so this verse we're going to see a number of treatments in the translations. Okay, let's get on to just actually looking at the Hebrew first. Okay, this verse is Numbers 24:8. This is in the middle of Balaam's last big curse blessing for Israel. Of course, Balak, the king of Moab, is enraged by Balaam's inability to curse the people of Israel. Okay, let's begin. Okay, El Motzi-o Mimitzrayim Ketoafot Re'em Lo Yochal Goyim Tzarav V'atzmotehem Yigarem V'chitzav Yimchatz. One more time. El Motzio Mimitzrayim Ketoafot Re'im Lo Yochal Goyim Tzarav V'atzmotehem Yigarem V'chitzav Yimchatz. Okay, the verbs first. Okay, Motzio. This comes from the root Yud Tzadi Aleph, Yitza, meaning to come out, to go out. So here, in this, we're not going to cover too much the conjugation here. Motzio means brought him out. Brought him out. Okay, the vav here means him or it. Okay, the next verb is yochal. Yochal. This is third person. And in the Pa'al binyan, in the Pa'al pattern of conjugations, this is an imperative. Ya is he. So this is third person masculine imperative. Not imperative. Imperfect, rather. So this would be so achal means aleph chaf lamed means to eat, consume. So yachal means he will consume, or it will consume. In Hebrew, there is no word it, so a male thing is called a he, and a female thing is called a she. And in English, that sounds weird, so by convention, we just translate that as it. It. Okay, yochal. He or it, masculine, will consume. Okay, we see the same pattern here. The word yigarem, the word here is, the shorish is gimel resh mem, meaning to break or to crush. So yigarem, he will crush. Okay, again, we see the same pattern here again. Yimchatz, yimchatz. The shorish is mem chet tzadi. Yimchatz. Again, this is the third person masculine imperfect, conventionally translated in the future tense. Yimchatz. He will wound, He will pierce. This word is basically almost always used for archery type things. Okay, it means like to wound with an arrow, or the pierce, to shoot him through. Okay, so that's the verbs. Okay, we have a couple common verbs, a couple roots, very common roots, yetza and achal, and then two very not too common roots, rare roots. Okay, the rare roots already create some kind of a problem for us, and that they're fairly rare. Okay, let's look at the non-verbs. El, of course, that is God. Mitzrayim, from Mitzrayim. El motzio mitzrayim, God brought him or it from Mitzrayim. Ke, like to'afot re'em, like the so to'afot is the plural of to'afa, means peak or raise up part. Here is talking about the raised up part, talking about basically the horns of the re'em. The re'em is a wild ox. Okay, so to'afot re'em, the horns of a wild ox. So to'afa again is raised up, a peak of some sort. Re'em is a wild ox. Frequently, this is the rarer phrase. Kato'afot re'em. It also says elsewhere in the Bible, karne re'em, like the horns of a wild ox. And even so, Karen means horn, but it can also mean pride. So in that instance, the word became synonymous with pride. So to here, this is an idiom referring to pride or proudly. Okay, so ka, like to'afot re'em, like the raised up horns of a re'em, a wild ox, a certain species that was indigenous to the Levant in those days. Okay, lo is to him. So el motzio mitzrayim, the God who brought him, it, from Mitzrayim, out of Mitzrayim. Of course, the it here is Israel. So the God that brought Israel out of Mitzrayim, ke, like to'afot re'em lo, like the uplifted horns of an ox, lo, for him or to him. Okay, that phrase in and of itself is mysterious, so we'll talk about that later in this video. Okay, yochal, he shall eat, different clause, new clause. Yochal, he shall eat or consume, goyim, nations. Tsarav, his afflictors. Tsar is affliction, persecution. So tsar, pain is tsar. So tsarav, those who afflict, those who persecute. So again, tsarim, that would be plural, and then the vav is possessive, his or its. Okay, goyim, tsarav, this is like almost a old parenthetical. Not all nations, but the nations who afflict the nation. But atzmotehem, and their etzem means bone, so atzmotehem, and their bones, hem, their, so it's possessive, their bones, yegarim, he shall crush, yikes. V'chitzav, a chetz is a arrow, an arrow, so chitzav means arrows. Yim chatz, he shall cause to pierce, he shall cause to wound. Again, chetz is the word for arrow. Notice that this is basically from the same root. Yim chatz, chitzav. So this word is associated with archery, with shooting arrows at people. Okay, fine. So basically, the arrow is going to meet its mark. Okay, let's one more time. Let's read it through, and then we'll get into what's confusing about this verse. El motzio mitzrayim, the God who brought him, or it, Mitzrayim, from Mitzrayim, Ke toafot re'em lo, like the uplifted horns of a re'em, lo, for him, or to him. Yochal goyim, it will consume nations. Tzarav, its oppressors, its persecutors. Atzmotehem, and its bones, and their bones, Yigarim, or it shall grind or crush. V'chitzav, and its arrows, or his arrows, Yimchatz, he will cause to pierce, he will cause to meet their mark. Okay, let's look at my translation, and then we'll get to the fun. I'll explain the problems. God who brought it, Israel, out of Egypt like the horns of a wild ox for him. It shall consume the nations, its persecutors, and their bones it shall crush, and its arrows it shall cause to pierce. Okay. So, let's look at the Hebrew. So, El Motzio, God who brought him, Mitzrayim, Ketofot Re'em, like the lifted up peaks of the Re'em, so basically the lifted up points of the Re'em, lo, to him, so, or for him. So does this lo refer to God, or does this lo, to or for him, refer to Israel? Question number one. So I can read it two ways. El Motzio Mitzrayim, Ketofot Re'em lo. The God who brought him out from Mitzrayim, Ketofot Re'em, like the uplifted horns of a Re'em, lo. So I can read it as if it was to him, so to speak, God, so to speak, carried the Jews out, the Israel out of Mitzrayim, uplifted like the horns of an ox, for him meaning God, or it can mean that God brought him out of Mitzrayim like the uplifted horns of an ox, lo, for him, meaning Israel. So in other words, either God is, either God is the ox or Israel's the ox, and so either God is the ox and Israel is like the horns, or you'll lift it up and proudly, or Israel is the ox and God is like the horns for God. Okay, that's difficulty number one. Where does this lo point? Does it point to him, meaning Israel, or does it point to God? Okay, another difficulty. It says, really this is just continuation of the same difficulty. It says, Yochal, he or it shall consume goyim, nations. So, does this yud point to, again, does it point to God? He shall consume, or does it point to Israel? It shall consume. As in, the nations shall consume the nations, the nation of Israel shall consume the nations that afflict it. In this case, the vav would also refer to Israel. Or does it mean that God will consume the nations that afflict it? So is this yud here God, El, or is it O, is it, as in this here? So where does, so basically I'm asking, is it a he or is it it? It could be both. Yochal could be both. So that is another translation issue. Tzarav, I think, is obvious. the ones doing persecuting, doing harm to it, meaning Israel. I think it's pretty obvious that this vav points here. Okay, fine. And their bones, meaning the bones of the nations. Yagarim, he shall crush, or it shall crush. It would go the same way. Fine. Chitzav is possessive. His arrows or its arrows. God's arrows, meaning some sort of figurative sense, or the its arrows, Israel, meaning in a much more literal sense. These projectile weapons. So is this some sort of poetry, or is this being literal? Okay. Yimchatz, he shall cause to pierce. Yimchatz. Again, he or it. Does this point here, or does this point here? To God or to Israel? Okay, so let's go back and look at my translation, see what I did. God who brought it, Israel, out of Egypt like the horns of a wild ox for him. So I say that lo here, it makes more sense to me that the lo points over here to God. Right? So to speak, God is like an ox, and he's holding high his cherished nation, proudly aloft like an ox holds, would hold very proudly up his horns. Okay, that's what I say. Of course, I could be totally wrong. This is a very difficult verse to translate, but this is what it sounds like to me. And then Yochal, I say, refers to it. I went back and forth on this one. It shall consume the goyim that afflict it, and their bones. It shall crush, it shall grind. The chitzav, and its arrows, yimchatz, it shall cause to pierce. So I say that all these other, what makes sense to me, all these others point to this vav here, it. Okay, of course, we could read it again. Alternatively, we could read it that it is God doing all these things in the direct sense, not in the protective sense to Israel, but in the direct sense. Now, the reason I opted for this translation was not anything based in the Hebrew. And in fact, I was just looking at the verse in isolation. I was actually leaning towards translating the yuds here, he shall, and the he shalls, as referring to God. Just in isolation, because it starts out here, this is subject, so I assume that the subject carried all throughout. And that very well might be what's going on here. However, this whole section, the famous Matovu section, deals with Israel is the subject matter, not God, and God is coming in to as a character, as a theme, a sub-theme in this section, the Matovu. So that and the other verses refer to Israel as an it. I chose to try to match the theme, the feel of the rest of the verses. So if you do yourself a favor, go over there and look at that section. Look at the Hebrew and play with it. So I believe this is what's going on. Again, of course, this is where the translator's art comes in. I could be completely wrong. Hope not. Okay, let's look at what other translations did. Okay, and I'm not going to pick about too much on other translations this time around because, again, I purposely chose a verse that was difficult to translate. So there will be a couple things that are obviously wrong. But for the most part, you'll see some different options here. Okay, KJV, God brought him being Israel, so that him, it thing. In the more older forms of English, it was common to refer to a thing, inanimate thing, as a him or a her. Okay, so God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, so this is the ka, like, the strength of an unicorn. Okay, so first of all, he, it's not capitalized, so they interpret the lo, it's not capitalized, so that they don't mean God, so they interpret the lo as we're pointing to here, to Israel. So he had the strength of a unicorn. It was a bit of a mystery what the Re'em was. Most of the commentators said it was some sort of ox, some sort of like that, but there was a few European commentators that said that it was this creature, the unicorn, and this carried over into the King James. Not correct, of course, there were no unicorns. But nevertheless, it captures some of the sort of the majesty of what's trying to be conveyed here. So it has the strength of an unicorn. Okay, so that's okay. Strength is not how I would do it. This is obviously an idiom meaning pride. So I wouldn't say it's strength, but oh well. So King James has lo pointing over here to him. Okay. Let's continue. He shall eat up the nations. Again, he here is not capitalized, so this refers to Israel. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies. So, Yochal Goyim, he shall eat the nations. Tzerav, his persecutors, his people causing him pain. Him, again, meaning it, the nation. And shall break their bones. V'atzmos osmotehem yigarim, he shall break their bones. And their bones he shall break. And shall break their bones. Fine. And pierce them through with his arrows. V'chitzav yimchatz, and his arrows, yimchatz, he will cause to pierce. So that is that. So basically, all of this business, God is here, but everything else, all the he-its throughout the rest of the verse are referring to Israel in the King James translation. Okay, let's look at the NIV. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. Okay, so the NIV is trying to update the English. So instead of saying him or it, they say they, because in English of our day, it is common to translate collective nouns as they. Just think about it. Do we say the family, it went to the park, or do we say the family, they went to the park? So it would be more common to say they went to the park. So that is the more common in today's English. However, in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, you would refer to a collective noun as an it, and they're gendered, so it would be either a he it or a she it, basically he or she. Okay, so they chose to change the its to theys. So God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. So lo here points over here to here. So they say it's they, but if it's it, they're pointing the lo over here to it, to Israel. They devour hostile nations. Again, they say they, but this is really an it. It devours goyim tzarov. They translate as hostile nations. Okay, not awful. Not just generally hostile, though. It's hostile to it. Hostile to it is how I translate it. And break their bones in pieces. A little wordy. Atzmosehem yigarim. Basically, he would break their bones in pieces is redundant. It's not in there. Okay, with their arrows, they pierce them. V'chitzav yimchatz. With their arrows, its arrows, their arrows, yimchatz, he pierces. He will cause to pierce. Them does not exist in the Hebrew. Them is pointing back to the nations. There is no them here in the Hebrew to point back to Goyim. Okay, so they, again, lo points over here. God is basically there. He brought him out and then basically set Israel free to do all these things, or predicts that Israel will do all these things. Okay, let's look at the NRSV. God who brings him out of Egypt is like the horns of a wild ox for him. Okay, let's look at the Hebrew. God, Motzi, who brings him, it, out of Mitzrayim, Katofot Re'em Lo. So the lo points again over here, and meaning that God is like the horns of a wild ox for Israel. In other words, God is, so it's not the other way around. So I said lo points to God. Okay, but they're saying it points to Israel. So God here figures like the proud horns, lifted up horns of a wild ox. So basically, God is the pride of Israel. Okay, like the horns of a wild ox for him. He shall devour the nations that are his foes. He, lowercase. Over here, he, it, shall devour the nations that are its foes. His foes, it's possessive, zarav, good. We would use words oive, so it would not say zarav, it would say oivav, or something like that. So zarav really is more than just foes. This is people who actually afflict, cause persecution. Okay, and break their bones. And break their bones. So basically, he will break their bones. So they should just say over again, he shall break their bones. Fine, he shall strike with his arrows. Okay, Yimchatz. So, all in all, not a bad translation. Again, what have they done? Essentially, all of the vavs point to Israel. All the vavs, all the yuds will point to Israel. And again, God is like the lifted up horns for Israel. Okay, so that's the NRSV. Let's look at the JPS. Further, God who freed them from Egypt is for them like the horns of a wild ox. Again, them, it's really it. They're just, again, changing it to help it match modern English. So instead of calling the nation an it, it's calling the nation a they. So the, again, also this lo here would point to Israel. So God who freed them from Egypt is for them, or for it, like the horns of a wild ox. So God is occupying this position. Again, I said it was the other way around. God basically brought them out like. And I said this is conjuring up some proud image of an animal with its head held high, with its horns held high. And that God held the Israel, his chosen nation, up in a position of pride, up high, for him, for himself. For God's self, not for the nation. Okay? I could be wrong. They could be wrong. I think it's hard to say, actually. Okay, fine. They shall devour enemy nations. Yochel goyim tzarav. Again, it's more than just enemies. It's people who actually cause affliction. Asmotayim yigarim, crush their bones. Okay. V'chitzav yimatz, and smash their arrows. Okay. The smash arrows, this is something, the arrows, yimchatz, he shall smash. That doesn't seem to be what's going on. One of the translations, I believe it was Onkelos, the ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah, I believe translates this way. However, the majority of translations, majority of commentators don't take it that way. They take it to mean that the arrows will find their mark. His arrows, the nation's arrows will find their mark. Okay, so that's that. So basically, the JPS keeps, like the others we've seen so far, this basically points to the yuds, the vavs point to the nation and not the God. Okay, finally the stone. It is God who brought him out of Egypt according to the power of his loftiness. Okay, his loftiness. Okay, they're interpreting the idiom already for you, which I don't like. We'll leave the interpreting to us and not to the reader and not to the translator. ArtScroll usually does not do this, but when they do it, they they do it. Okay, no translation is perfect. Every translation has its issues. So by and large, the ArtScroll, the stone, is very, very literal, but in this instance, it is not being literal. It is interpreting the meaning of the idiom. So it is God who brought him out of Egypt according to the power of his loftiness. El Motzio Mimitzrayim Ketofod Re'em Lo. The lo here would point to God. That's how I translated it. The lo points to God. Fine. He, and again, it breaks off as a period here, so this can be misleading, whether the he is really capital or lowercase. Is this he referring to God or referring to Israel? Yeah, I think it means it's referring to Israel because of the rest of the verses. He will consume the nations that oppress, okay, tzarav, that oppress him, and crush their bones. Vasosayim Yagarim, he shall crush. Okay, they don't give us a pronoun there, so again, it's hard to say. And his arrows, Chitzav Yimchatz, shall pierce them. Okay, again, there is no them there, so that is an interpolation into the text. But what they have done here is they've, I think, very well maintained the sort of obscurity of the verse, the difficulty in reading the verse. What they've done, if you think about it, he really, by putting a period here and capitalizing this, he, and then not repeating the pronoun, he could be God or he could be it, meaning Israel. He will consume the nations that oppress him. So this is lowercase. He, meaning God, would destroy the nations that oppress it, and their bones, Yigarim, and crush their bones. So it doesn't use a pronoun here. So there's no need to worry about a capital or a lowercase he. And his arrows, its arrows, meaning the nations, shall pierce them. And he does not give us the pronoun for the verb to tell us whether this is capital H he or a lowercase he, meaning it. So they've preserved in the English a great deal of the subtlety in the Hebrew. So even though they add a couple words in, I think this is a very good job on their part. Basically smoothing over, not smoothing over, but maintaining some of the difficulty in reading this verse. I don't like that they chose to translate the idiom loftiness or pride. I think it would have been better just to include the Tofot Re'em. He lifted up horns of a Re'em. I think that would have been better. Okay, so, but by and large, I do like what they did with the second section here of the verse. Okay, so all in all, we see that there's some different treatments and difficulty. It's hard for me to say actually which one is best. I think the bulk trend is that lo would point to Israel, with the exception of ArtScroll, who seems to point it towards God. I myself also chose to point the lo towards God because it just made sense to me. And then I chose to translate the rest of it in the rest of the verse in the he, lowercase he / it manner, because of the context in which this verse appears. It appears in a little section of a handful of verses discussing the children of Israel, because after all, Balak wanted Balaam to curse the nation of Israel. Okay, let us look, I guess, one more time at the verse. El Motzio, God who brought him, it, Mitzrayim, out of Mitzrayim, Ketofot Re'im Lo, like the uplifted horns of a Re'im, Lo, for him or it. Yochal Goim, it shall consume nations. Tzarav, its oppressors, its persecutors. Ha'atzmotehem Yegarim, and their bones it shall crush. V'chitzav, and its arrows, or possibly even his arrows. Yimchatz, it will cause to pierce. He will cause the arrows to strike their mark. Okay, so all in all, a hard verse. To those of you who are in class with me, I wanted to give an example of how hard it is sometimes when doing the math. I have referred to this problem, this issue of always keeping in mind where the pronouns are pointing as best practices in translating and in reading. So here, this is an example in which it becomes very difficult to understand exactly where the pronouns are pointing to. Okay, I hope that was an experience. Hope it was educational. Hope everything was as clear, at least as clear as mud. Hope you'll join me again next week for another verse. Kol Tuv, Slach Haraba. Keep learning.